In the early months of 1973, a series of fires began burning in the basements of government buildings in Langley, Virginia. They were not accidents. They were controlled, deliberate, and urgent. Under the direct orders of CIA Director Richard Helms, who was soon to depart his post, thousands of pages of documents meticulously recorded over 2 decades were fed into industrial shredders and incinerators. Among these files were the only official accounts of a program that had operated in the shadows of American cities for nearly 20 years. When the smoke finally cleared, a vast architecture of secrecy had been dismantled, leaving behind only fragments of a narrative that the public was never meant to piece together. But those fragments pointed toward a series of unremarkable apartments in New York and San Francisco, places where the walls were wired for sound, the drinks were laced with chemicals, and the guests never knew they were being watched. To understand why these records had to disappear, we have to look back to a world that felt as though it was slipping into madness. In the early 1950s, the United States was gripped by a specific, clinical kind of fear. The Korean War had produced chilling images of American prisoners of war appearing on film, seemingly denouncing their own country with glazed eyes and monotonous voices. To the intelligence community, this wasn't just propaganda. It was evidence of a new kind of weapon. They believed the Soviet Union and China had unlocked a way to rewrite the human mind, to brainwash an individual until their core beliefs were erased. The CIA became convinced that a mind control gap existed, and they were determined to close it by any means necessary. This atmosphere of existential dread birthed Project MKUltra. It was a sprawling, multi-headed effort to master the human psyche, but at its heart was a quest for a truth serum or a memory-erasing compound. The agency needed to know if a person could be made to confess, to forget, or to act against their will through the use of drugs, hypnosis, and isolation. But testing these theories in a laboratory setting had its limits. They needed a more realistic environment. They needed a place where the variables of the real world could be observed without the subject's knowledge. But the threat wasn't just coming from the outside. It was being nurtured within the very agencies meant to protect the state. The program required a specific type of operative, someone comfortable in the gray areas of the law and the dark corners of the city. They found that man in George Hunter White. White was a high-ranking official in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a man who had spent years undercover in the underworld. He was a hardened, cynical operative who famously believed that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and he seemed eager to wield a bit of that power himself. In 1953, White was recruited by the CIA's technical services staff, led by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Together, they would establish the first safe houses, a term that, in this context, was deeply ironic. The first of these locations was an apartment in New York City's Greenwich Village. To the neighbors, it was just another residence in a bohemian neighborhood. Inside, however, the CIA had installed two-way mirrors and state-of-the-art recording equipment. White's instructions were simple: find subjects, administer various substances, primarily the newly discovered diethylamide, or LSD, and observe the results. There were no informed consent forms. There were no medical doctors on standby. There was only George White, sitting behind a two-way mirror with a martini in his hand, watching the lives of unsuspecting citizens unravel in real time. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. The New York experiments provided a proof of concept, but they were limited by the city's density and the difficulty of finding subjects who wouldn't be missed. The program needed to scale. In 1955, White was transferred to San Francisco, where he oversaw the creation of a much more ambitious operation. Under the Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA leased a 2-bedroom apartment at 225 Chestnut Street, perched on the scenic slopes of Telegraph Hill. From the outside, the building offered a stunning view of the San Francisco Bay. Inside, It was a laboratory of human degradation. The San Francisco safe house was decorated to resemble a high-end bachelor pad of the era. It featured French posters on the walls, lush carpeting, and a kitchen stocked with liquor. But behind the bedroom walls were the familiar two-way mirrors. This time, the agency had refined its recruitment strategy. They hired local sex workers to lure men back to the apartment. These men, often businessmen or sailors, were unknowingly given drinks spiked with high doses of LSD. They were then led into the bedroom while White and his associates watched from the other side of the glass. The records that survived suggest that the agency wasn't just interested in the drug's effects on memory or confession. They were studying the intersection of drugs and sexual blackmail. They wanted to know if a person's biological urges could be leveraged to make them more susceptible to control. Some historians believe that the safe houses were also used to test various delivery systems, aerosol sprays, specialized glassware, even poisoned cigarettes. The apartment on Chestnut Street became a theater of the surreal, where the boundaries of ethics and legality were completely erased in the name of national security. And that's when things began to shift. As the 1950s turned into the 60s, the program expanded even further. A second safe house was established in San Francisco at 1506 Lombard Street. The nature of the experiments became increasingly erratic. George White's journals, which were not part of the official CIA destruction in 1973, paint a picture of a man who began to treat the safe houses as his own private fiefdom. He hosted parties where guests were unknowingly dosed. He used his position to harass subversives and beatniks under the guise of intelligence gathering. The line between a government operation and a personal obsession had blurred into non-existence. Inside the agency, Sidney Gottlieb remained the primary architect. Gottlieb was a man of contradictions, a folk-dancing, goat-milking scientist who spent his days dreaming up ways to destroy the human ego. He believed that the mind had to be broken before it could be rebuilt. The safe houses were his primary source of data. From the safety of their observation rooms, the CIA operatives watched as subjects experienced terrifying hallucinations, acute paranoia, and total psychological collapses. There is no clear consensus on how many people passed through these doors, but some estimates suggest hundreds, perhaps thousands, were subjected to these tests over the years. What remains unclear is how the agency managed to keep this hidden for so long. The safe houses were located in residential neighborhoods. The subjects were civilians. The activities were inherently loud and unpredictable. Yet, for nearly 20 years, the program operated without a single leak to the press or the local police. It was a testament to the absolute control the CIA held over its operations and the terrifying vulnerability of the people they targeted. But as the 1960s progressed, the cultural landscape began to change, and the very drugs the CIA had hoped to weaponize were leaking into the streets. The summer of love was about to begin, and the agency's secret experiments were on a collision course with a new era of public scrutiny. The 1963 Inspector General's report, a document that would not surface for decades, offered a rare and chilling internal critique of what was happening behind those closed doors. The report noted that the testing was vulnerable to a charge of being unethical, and that the agency was essentially operating a series of brothels on American soil. Yet, the experiments didn't stop. Instead, they became more specialized. While the public saw the 1950s as an era of suburban conformity, the safe houses were exploring the most jagged edges of human experience. One of the most unsettling aspects of the San Francisco operation was what George White called his safaris. These were not trips to the wilderness, but excursions into the city's nightlife to identify disposable people, individuals whose disappearance or distress would not trigger an investigation. These included the homeless, the addicted, and those living on the fringes of society. They were brought to the safe house, where the experiments often moved beyond LSD. Some records suggest the use of heroin, barbiturates, and even paralyzing agents. The goal had shifted from simply extracting truth to seeing if a human being could be reduced to a blank slate, a tabula rasa, that the agency could then rewrite. But, as the scientists in Langley pored over the data, a frustrating reality began to emerge. The results were wildly inconsistent. Instead of a predictable truth serum, LSD produced a chaotic spectrum of reactions. Some subjects became hypertalkative. Others retreated into a catatonic state. Some experienced religious epiphanies, while others suffered permanent psychological breaks. The dream of a surgical tool for the mind was proving to be a blunt instrument that shattered everything it touched. And that's when the program began to lose its clinical veneer entirely. As the 1960s progressed, the atmosphere inside the safe houses grew darker. George White, by then a legendary and feared figure, seemed to revel in the power he held. Archival photographs from this period show White in his apartment, surrounded by the tools of his trade, hidden microphones, one-way mirrors, and shelves of liquor. His personal journals, filled with cynical observations, suggest that the line between intelligence work and personal indulgence had been completely erased. He wrote of his time in San Francisco with a chilling sense of nostalgia, describing it as a period where he could harass, push, and sometimes destroy those he deemed unworthy. In Washington, the oversight that should have caught these excesses was non-existent. Project MK Ultra was compartmentalized to such a degree that even high-ranking CIA officials were kept in the dark. The funds for the safe houses were funneled through a complex web of front companies and cutouts, making the paper trail almost impossible to follow. It was a closed loop. Sidney Gottlieb provided the chemicals and the theoretical framework, while George White provided the subjects and the laboratory. They were accountable to no one but themselves. But the world outside the safe house walls was changing. The very drugs the CIA had been testing in secret were now being championed by a burgeoning counterculture. The mind control gap the agency feared had turned into a cultural explosion that they could not contain. Ironically, some of the very individuals who had been part of the early, legitimate medical trials of LSD, people like Ken Kesey and Robert Hunter, would go on to fuel the psychedelic revolution. The agency had helped release a ghost they could no longer control. What happened next remains unclear, but internal tremors began to shake the program. By the late 1960s, the strategic value of the safe houses was being questioned. The Truth Serum Project had largely failed to produce a reliable chemical weapon. Furthermore, the rising tide of anti-war sentiment and a newfound skepticism toward the deep state meant that the risks of exposure were higher than ever. The safe houses in San Francisco and New York were quietly shuttered. The mirrors were taken down, the recording equipment was stripped, and the apartments were returned to the rental market, their secrets hidden behind fresh coats of paint. But the end of the safe houses was only the beginning of a much larger crisis for the agency. In 1972, the Watergate scandal broke, tearing a hole in the veil of government secrecy. As investigative journalists and congressional committees began to dig into the dirty tricks of the executive branch, the CIA's leadership realized they were sitting on a mountain of radioactive evidence. Richard Helms, who had been a staunch supporter of Gottlieb's work since the beginning, knew that if the details of MK Ultra, and specifically the safe houses, were made public, the agency might not survive the fallout. The safe houses weren't just a legal liability. They were a moral catastrophe. They represented a fundamental violation of the social contract. The government using its own citizens as lab rats in a theater of psychological horror. In the early days of 1973, as Helms prepared to leave his post as Director of Central Intelligence, he issued the order that would define the legacy of the program. He commanded that all records related to MK Ultra be destroyed. Witnesses would later describe the scene: filing cabinets being wheeled toward incinerators, the smell of burning paper filling the halls of Langley, years of data, thousands of individual stories, and the clinical details of every session in San Francisco and New York were reduced to ash. Helms believed he had successfully cleansed the agency's history. He believed that without the records, the program had effectively never happened. But he had underestimated the persistence of the paper trail. In 1974, a New York Times journalist named Seymour Hersh published a bombshell report detailing massive illegal domestic spying by the CIA. The story didn't mention the safe houses yet, but it broke the dam of silence. Suddenly, the agency was under the microscope of the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission. During these hearings, the first whispers of behavioral modification and drug testing began to surface. The committee members were stunned. They asked for the records. They were told the records no longer existed. It was a stone wall that seemed impenetrable. However, a small group of investigators refused to accept that every trace had been erased. They began to look for the financial shadows, the budget authorizations and travel vouchers that had survived because they were filed in the wrong departments. And that's when they found the name of a man who had been dead for years, but whose ghost still haunted the San Francisco streets. The discovery of George White's private papers was a turning point. Unlike the official CIA files, White's journals and personal correspondence had not been shredded. They provided a raw, unfiltered look at Operation Midnight Climax. They described the shack-ups, the spiking, and the clinical observation of human suffering. For the first time, the investigators had a map of the safe houses. They had the addresses. They had a glimpse into the safaris. Yet, as the investigators began to piece together the timeline, they realized a terrifying discrepancy. The records Helms destroyed in 1973 were said to be the complete history of the program. But the clues found in the financial archives suggested that the safe houses might have been part of something even larger, a network of locations that spanned not just 2 cities, but perhaps dozens of sites across North America and Europe. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 1977, 4 years after Richard Helms believed he had successfully buried the secrets of MKUltra, a Freedom of Information Act request yielded a discovery that sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. A clerk in the CIA's financial archives stumbled upon several boxes that had been misfiled and, crucially, overlooked during the 1973 purge. These boxes contained roughly 20,000 pages of financial records, receipts, travel vouchers, and budget authorizations. While they were not the detailed experimental logs Helms had destroyed, they provided a cold, hard skeleton of the program's scale. The financial trail revealed that the safe houses in New York and San Francisco were only the visible peaks of a much larger iceberg. Records suggest that the agency had funded research at over 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, and prisons. But it was the sub-projects numbered 1 through 149 that hinted at the program's true diversity. The safe house operations, known internally as Sub-Project 13, were part of a vast ecosystem of human experimentation that stretched across the country. The 1,977 discovery led to a new round of Senate hearings, chaired by Senator Ted Kennedy. For the first time, the public heard the name of Sidney Gottlieb and the details of Operation Midnight Climax. The testimony was chilling. Intelligence officials admitted to unwitting testing on American citizens, but when pressed for names, for locations, or for the long-term health of the subjects, they had no answers. The documents that could have provided those names were gone, and the memories of the men involved were conveniently selective. But that wasn't the strangest part of the fallout. As the hearings progressed, It became clear that the agency had no mechanism for tracking the people they had dosed. There were no follow-up studies, no medical monitoring, and no outreach to those who might have suffered permanent psychological damage. The subjects were treated as disposable data points. In the eyes of the investigators, the safe houses weren't just a failure of ethics, they were a failure of science. Without a controlled environment or follow-up, the years of drugging and observation had produced almost nothing of intelligence value. The personal stories that did emerge were fragments of lives interrupted. There were reports of men who had suffered sudden, inexplicable mental breakdowns in the mid-1950s, unaware for decades that their drinks had been spiked by government agents. Some historians believe that the safe houses may have been responsible for a string of unsolved psychiatric crises and even suicides in the San Francisco area, though the lack of records makes this impossible to prove. The trauma was there, etched into the lives of the victims, but the fingerprints of the perpetrator had been wiped clean. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In the late 1970s, as the investigation into MKUltra was winding down, a letter surfaced that George White had written to Sidney Gottlieb just before White's death. In the letter, White looked back on his time in the safe houses with a disturbing sense of pride. He wrote, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the highest authority?" This admission suggests that for the men on the ground, the safe houses were never about the mind control gap or national security. They were about the intoxicating power of absolute immunity. The safe houses provided a space where the rules of civilization did not apply, a dark playground where the state's resources were used to indulge the most predatory instincts of its operatives. Today, the buildings that once housed these experiments still stand. The apartment on Chestnut Street in San Francisco is now a high-priced residence, its windows still looking out over the bay. The travelers who walk past the brownstones in Greenwich Village have no idea they are passing the site of a government-sanctioned house of horrors. The physical spaces have been reclaimed by the city, but the questions they leave behind remain unanswered. Modern re-examinations of the surviving financial records continue to raise new questions. Some researchers point to suspicious budget entries, suggesting that secret safe houses may have existed in other cities, perhaps Chicago, Los Angeles, or even New Orleans. There is no clear consensus on whether these sites were ever operational, or if they were merely planned and abandoned. The truth remains buried in the silence of those who took their secrets to the grave. The legacy of the 1950s Safe House program is not just one of drug testing and surveillance. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when an organization is granted the power to operate beyond the reach of the law in the name of an existential threat. It reveals a period of American history where the line between the protector and the predator became indistinguishable. As we look back at the fragments that survived the fires of 1973, we are left with a haunting realization. We know what happened in the apartments in San Francisco and New York, not because the system worked, but because of a series of administrative errors and the personal journals of a man who enjoyed his work too much. It forces us to wonder how many other programs, how many other safe houses, and how many other victims were successfully erased from the record, leaving no paper trail to follow. The files were destroyed, the mirrors were broken, and the fires at Langley long ago went cold. But the shadow of the safe houses persists, a reminder that the most dangerous secrets are often hidden in plain sight, behind the doors of an ordinary apartment, on an ordinary street, in a world that believes it is being watched over. What happened inside those rooms changed the lives of hundreds of people who never knew why their reality suddenly shattered. And while the official history has been redacted into oblivion, the echoes of those experiences remain an unfinished narrative of a time when the government decided that the only way to save the human mind was to learn how to break it.